Hello, my name is Anthony Campagato. This is my first video, so I'm probably going to make a lot of rookie mistakes, like not looking at the camera and fumbling over my words, but that's not so big of a deal, I guess. I guess I'll start by just telling you really quickly about myself. I'm a very avid gamer of all kinds. I do less video games now, but I do play some video games, but mostly I do tabletop war games, things like Kings of War, Warhammer 40K, a few other select games like that. I also do pen and paper RPGs like D&D, which I've been getting into more and more and more. I'll tell you, I'm not one of those guys that has been playing D&D since I was a small kid. I've always been interested in it, but I never really got a chance to seriously start playing. Probably until about a couple years ago, thanks to my good friend Ryan, who's a phenomenal DM and who provided a lot of great learning experience for me, both as a character and a DM. So that's been great. I also do a lot of board gaming and a few card games here and there, that kind of thing. But the reason I'm making this video and what will eventually be a video series is because my friend Ryan that I mentioned just wound down like almost 2 years of play of a homebrew that he did, which was fantastic. And to give him an opportunity to play and to try my hand at something different, I decided to start DMing a campaign. Now, because I don't have nearly as much experience in both the game and as a DM, I decided I'd make my life a little easier, and rather than having to come up with everything, I would run one of the pre-done campaign books for the 5th edition of D&D. So what I decided to do was run Out of the Abyss, because Ryan's campaign focused heavily around the idea of dragons and there being dragon gods and that kind of thing, which just, it sounded too much like things like the Wrath of the Dragon Queen, I think it's called, or Horde of the Dragon Queen and Rise of Tiamat and that kind of thing. I loved the idea of that adventure, but since some of my players, in fact almost all of my players, are taken from that other campaign, I thought it would be too similar for them. And I've always loved the ideas of kind of the good guys fighting against the literal forces of darkness, like the idea of demons and that kind of thing. So it sounded like a natural fit for me and for my party, so that's what I decided to do. Now, after buying the book and reading through the book and getting myself set up with everything that I felt that I would need to kind of run a good campaign, I joined up with the Facebook group Out of the Abyss DMs, which has been just absolutely phenomenal resource of learning and problem solving and things like this, and watching a few other videos of DMs who were running things. I kind of got to the point where it seemed like a lot of people were saying, if you were a new DM and really just looking to try your hand at it, that Out of the Abyss is maybe not the one to start with, because there's so many moving pieces and lots to keep track of, and it's fairly open sandbox style play. But I said, yeah, you know what, I've never been one to take the easy path, so let's give that a shot. So after weeks and I'll say months of prep, because it was determined before our last campaign ended that I would be doing this one, I got to the point where last Sunday, so a couple days ago, I ran my players through the first session. And I was really, really happy with how it turned out. It was a lot of fun. I tried to take it the extra mile, especially because it was a first session, almost to set the hook for a lot of players, so to speak. So I'll tell you a little bit about the players, I suppose, first. I'm not going to name any of my players by name. I'll just kind of talk about their characters. But all of us know each other. There's no one kind of random. I actually am part owner of the kind of most prominent local game store. I live in a fairly small community. But we don't play there. We actually just come over and we play at my house. In fact, I'm recording this right at the table where we normally do all of our gaming. So my players are all pretty good friends of mine. I'm working with 4, but due to some personal circumstances for one of my players and unforeseen circumstances, it looks like the party is going to be probably expanded to 5. I wanted to do just 4 because I was pretty sure that most of these modules and books are made with the idea of all the challenges being for a party of 4 players. And it looks like, because I had someone who couldn't make it, we brought in a replacement, and he has enjoyed it so much and has the availability now, which I didn't think that he had, that he'll be able to play every single time. And so that's great. So basically, we'll either run it for 5, and I'll make adjustments where necessary, or if there's the odd time where someone can't make it, then that will only reduce us to 4, and that should work perfectly. So yeah, so I have basically 5 players, only 4 present in the first session. So we have a half-orc barbarian, which seems pretty like stereotypical, except the story that this character's player gave me, she did a great job with the idea of the mother was the orc. Her character, whose name is Bard, never knew the mother, was completely raised by humans, thinks himself to be very intelligent, but in actuality is kind of dumb as a stump. But that being said, for a half-orc, because he was raised by humans, he's very kind of empathic. He's very kind of like the background chosen for him was folk hero, because the little village where he grew up, he was the biggest and the strongest, so he always dealt with things like thieves and miscreants that would come into the town, stuff like that. So really good-natured kind of character, and really kind of funny based on the fact that, he almost thinks that his intelligence or that his abilities are almost magical because of how kind of dim he is. But he's a good character. Then we have Colby Jack, who is a half-elf warlock, and this character is really cool, really kind of funny, because he's a warlock with the Pack of the Chain. Of course, I started everyone at level 1, so he doesn't get a lot of the cool features that the classes get once they start hitting level 3 and things like this. So the familiar isn't quite there, but the familiar plays a huge part, because the idea is that his character was a bit of a ladies' man, and everything that you would imagine comes with that. And essentially one night he kind of bit off more than he can chew, and he had like the best, he found the prettiest girl and had the night of his life, and then woke up and found out that he had actually kind of spent the night with a demon lord whose name I don't recall, but is a female demon lord of deception and change, that actually isn't featured in the campaign book, which is kind of nice. And basically she cursed him, and said, well, you kind of are going to be my servant now, because of how capable you are as a merchant and as a person. So essentially that's where his power comes from as a warlock. And so what makes it really neat, though, is that the familiar that he will eventually get is this little imp that he is named Poncho. And Poncho basically acts as a bit of an envoy, to say, well, in this situation, keep in mind that the mistress would want you to do X, Y, and Z, which is, creates some conundrums for the character, who in and of himself is not like an evil person. But the other thing is that because of the nature of the character and because of the nature of the circumstance, Poncho is also a little bit of a horn dog, who often will get the character into trouble by saying, like, well, in addition to anything else, you should go hit on that girl over there, or that dog. It could be anything, and it creates a lot of humorous circumstances, but that also creates problems for the characters. And I love when players go out of their way to create problems for their characters, because I think that it helps in story building, and I'll always be fast to reward people with smart little things like that. Who else do we have? We have, so my friend Ryan that I was telling you about, and I guess he'll be the only one really mentioned on camera here, is who DM'd before. He now is having an opportunity to play. And he is a great character as well. I believe his name is Sir Robert Bastian. And he is basically a noble-born human paladin who essentially is like already an established adventurer. He's a member of, I think, the Order of the Gauntlet. And what has happened to him is he was betrayed by another noble lord, and they basically killed his family, which I know sounds cliched, but again, I like when players make problems for their characters. And essentially what this has led to is that, well, in his backstory, Sir Robert might have been like a level 10 adventurer kind of thing due to all of his exploits. At this point, he's a level 1 because he just absolutely lost faith in his god and in justice, because of this betrayal, and that his family was murdered, and that there was nothing he could do about it, as he was, I think, eventually kind of like in that same betrayal sold into slavery of the drow type of thing. So he plays his character as a very kind of ho-hum, what's the point, life is terrible, I'm looking even for a reason to care about being a prisoner type of thing. So that was very neat. Our stand-in player, who's kind of made up for the original fourth party member, is playing a really cool race I'd never even heard of. I guess it was a supplement that came out for the Tomb of Annihilation, but I told people, I was like, hey, if it exists in like an official, print or digital form put out by Wizards, then your game, just make sure I have the information. So he's playing a monk, but his monk is, I think it's called a tortle, which is basically a tortoise or turtle person. And he is so cool. His player's name, I believe, is Uta. And Uta is, which I thought was funny because that's basically the abbreviation of the campaign Out of the Abyss, OOTA, when it was a complete coincidence because this person was added last minute. His player's name is, or his character's name is Uta, and this monk he's not afraid to be violent when he needs to, but he's very slow moving because he's like a turtle. He speaks very slowly because, again, I guess this is how the player imagined a turtle to be. But he's very wise, very meditative. So I guess like he's almost a little bit like the Obi-Wan Kenobi of the group, I guess, like episode 4 Obi-Wan Kenobi, very kind of older and slower, but knows how to handle himself and is very wise. So he's pretty great. Now, our last player, who was unable to make it to the first session, but I think should be pretty reliable on the way through, is playing. I haven't actually met the character, so I can't remember if it's a half elf or an elf, but essentially, they're a bard, and their name is Ken LaFlaunt. And I've encountered a character like this ran by the same player before, and the premise, I think, remains the same, is that Ken LaFlaunt tends to speak in a lot of rhyme, and he doesn't tend to use a instrument as a bard. He's more of an orator. He uses his words to do everything that a bard would do. And he also has this little quirk that no one's really sure of, but what he tells people is that his wife, he lost his wife by some means at some point, but that her ghost still hangs around. And this is just a story point. There's no stats for his wife. His wife never actually does anything, but Ken will often talk to his wife, and only Ken can hear what his wife says back. So whether or not Ken is crazy, which is something that could be worked into the campaign because it operates on madness a lot, or whether the ghost is actually there and only Ken can see her, is up for debate. But again, it makes for very interesting characters. So the balance of classes, the colorful personalities of these characters, I'm really happy with my party, and that's who's going to be playing with me. I'll tell you a little bit about how I set up the first scenario. It was, the characters all start off as prisoners of the drow in the drow encampment of Velkenvelv in the Underdark. So it's a very alien, very dark, and a very grim situation because, as other DMs might know, and if you're a player, please don't read into the book. It spoils it for you, spoils it for the DM. So we'll operate on a trust here. I'm going to do my best not to give anything away either, but just keep in mind that don't read ahead. But it's a very alien thing, and in the book it says, the players have all been there for an indeterminate amount of time determined by a D10. So I had 2 players who were there for 8 days already. I had 1 player there who had been there for 6 days, and Colby had been a relatively new arrival, only being there for a day. So there was kind of an already impending sense of doom where it's like, well, we've been here and we don't see a way out of here and all that kind of thing. So there was that aspect, of course. I tried to set up literal environmental mood. Right above me, I have a chandelier with 5 lights, and I replaced all of the lights with purple LED lights. And because there's 5 of them, it's bright enough that you can see and read and write and all that kind of stuff. But I thought, how are you going to get a real good sense of the Underdark across to players when you're sitting in bright light? So I replaced them all with these purple LEDs, and it was perfect. My player who played Bard, she actually at my request brought over some snacks, and she had cheese stuffed mushroom caps because I thought, hey, it's the Underdark, gotta eat mushrooms. So that's what we did. So the atmosphere was amazing, and everyone really enjoyed that. So we kind of started up the story, and I'm not going to give a really long play-by-play of how it all went down, but I'm going to focus on maybe the more interesting parts, both for the players and for me as a dungeon master. So they're obviously they start in the pen, and there's like 10 other NPCs that start in this pen with them. And I have none of my things in front of me because making this video was a little impromptu, but I'm going to do my best to remember everything. So the 10 PCs are a male Darrow, which is like a kind of like a gangly, crazy deep dwarf named Bupito. We've got a male Kuatoa, which is like a fish person who typically are kind of nutty, like evil nutty. But this one is kind of, his name is Shushar the Awakened, and he is like has found his zen, so to speak. He's a total pacifist, and he just is like, yeah, like, you know, I'm trying to recreate the voice I did with them because everything for the Kuatoa is very like strange. Like the settlement that they live nearby is called Sloop Bludop, right? Which sounds really funny to say. So I developed a voice for this character that I tried to say, well, what kind of voice would say those kinds of names and it sound natural, as opposed to like I have to remember what I'm trying to say. So I came up with this very kind of blubbery kind of like oh, I'm the Awakened and I come from you know, to me that sounded right, and it was goofy. And the Kuatoa are supposed to be like the strangest thing most of these like PCs have ever seen. So they really liked that, and that's what I went with. So we got those two. We've got Bupito, we've got Shushar the Awakened. We've got a pair of Deep Gnome, or Cernephilim, if I'm saying that right, a pair of Deep Gnome twins, a boy and a girl, named Topsy and Turvy. That the party's not really sure of what's going on with them yet because they're pretty quiet. We've got another Deep Gnome in there called Jim Jar, who was just an instant favorite amongst the PCs. Jim Jar is a very kind of like suave, jittery, devil-may-care kind of rogue, I guess you'd call him, who just has like this, he just bets on everything. He just wants to bet on everything. He mentally perfectly keeps track of all bets made, whether he owes money or is owed money, what the difference is, all that kind of thing. So that was really fun and neat, you know, where Jim Jar would go over, and Jim Jar came out on the fly. I just let him be what he was going to be, and so a character, one of the PCs approached Jim Jar to kind of say, you know, because I said, look, if you've been there 8 days, you know 2 prisoners that you would have saddled up to. So tell me who they are, and we'll do some role play there. The 6th day and the 1 day, we're going to say that you picked one person to saddle up to. So one of them picked Jim Jar, and it was very much the idea of, you know, the PCs would say, well, like, what do you know about what's going on here, and like, how do you do you want to get out of here? How do you know how to get out of here? And Jim Jar would reply with a very kind of attitude that is like, oh yeah, I'll get out of here. I'll get out of here. I mean, I don't know how to get out of here. I probably would have done it already if I could have. But if you have a plan, I'm with that plan. Hey, I'll tell you what. I'll bet you 10 gold that we're out of here before the end of the day. Would you take that bet? Would you take that bet with Jim Jar? You know, there's that kind of a character that everyone really liked and that I really enjoyed role playing as well. So we got Jim Jar and those other deep gnomes. We got an orc in there, kind of like a disgraced orc kind of thing named Ront, who is realistically a bully in a lot of senses. We also have a little myconid or myconoid. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. I'm going to say myconid. A little myconid sprout, they're like mushroom people, but this is just a sprout. So it's like a 5-year-old kid kind of thing. So what it basically looks like is a giant mushroom with 2 stubby legs. And Stool is his name, and Stool is terrified because he's a 5-year-old who's in prison. Like he's alone, he's lonely, he's terrified. And a couple of the PCs really kind of said, "Oh, like I feel bad for this little guy, and I want to protect him." There's also Eldith, a female shield dwarf. You know, who is the kind of classic hero, I guess. I guess in the in this cell, she has an intense hatred of like underdark races that are evil, such as like Drow and the Dwargar, who are like the deep dwarves that are basically evil dwarves. But she's very willing to kind of like be, you know, I'm up to the challenge and I'm self-sacrificing and that type of thing. And so there was some, especially I think Sir Robert kind of, you know, enjoyed her as another kind of stalwart defender. We also had Prince Darendil. And Prince Darendil is basically a Quagoth from all looks, and Quagoth are like this servitor race of the Drow. They're like imagine like a scaled down, less hairy Wampa. You know what I mean? They're like all hunched over and hairy and very scary and strong with claws. They look like bear people almost, without a snout. And so he's in this cell, and he was approached by actually Sir Robert, who kind of said, like, what are you doing in here? And what surprises the characters is that when Prince Darendil talks, he kind of just goes from this to just straightening himself up and responding in this urbane elven accent that is like, well, I'm a captive just like the rest of you. And everyone's kind of like, what the hell? Like, this doesn't make any sense. And what he found out by talking to him is that Prince Darendil is an elven prince from like the surface world, from a forest kingdom, who was cursed by an evil wizard, I think by the name of like Terester or something like that, and polymorphed into a Quagoth form, and now he's like trapped in that form. And the form kind of is like taking, you know, every now and then he like slips a little bit more into being more of a Quagoth than an elven prince. And so he actually identified with Sir Robert as of being of nobility, and so they kind of created a bit of a friendship with each other, especially because you know, Prince Darendil says to them, oh, well, you know, I used to study as this mage, and I'm actually a very talented caster, but you know, I suppose I could be physical if the situation requires, given the new form, you know, make lemonade and all that, is pretty much Prince Darendil's attitude. And I'm just trying to think if I've missed anyone here. I don't think that I have, and I'm sure I'll kick myself later if I did. Oh, there's actually another dark elf. There's another drow in the cell with him named Sereth. And Sereth is a bit of an odd duck, and he's basically told the party that he's in the cell because he was accused of like basically freaking out, like going nuts and murdering one of his fellow dark elf guards, because he actually used to be a guard at Valkenvelv, and now he's a prisoner in the slave pens kind of thing. So it was really interesting to see that relationship. I think originally the PCs kind of said, "Oh, you're a drow, and we hate you, and we're glad that you're in here," kind of thing. And then as they saw how he could be useful, and that he was just as kind of vengeful towards the drow for putting him in the cell, they kind of said, "Oh, this guy is actually kind of neat." So we had this time of them getting to know everyone, and then having their first experience with Mistress Elvara, who is a high priestess of Lolth, the drow goddess kind of thing, or demon goddess of spiders. And she runs the whole joint. She runs all of Valkenvelv. And she has an apprentice kind of thing called another dark elf priestess named Asha. And she also has two male drow warriors that tend to be with her all the time. One of them is Jorlin, and one of them is Shor. And Jorlin used to be her favored because, like, I guess, you know, drow are a matriarchal society, and that he was like Ilvara's chosen mate and had her favor. And then on an adventure in the Underdark nearby, Jorlin was attacked by like a gray ooze, which is like an acidic blob monster, and it hit him, and it like basically melted the side of his face and neck and made him very physically unappealing. And it didn't take very long for Elvara to basically cast him aside and say, you know, I don't want you anymore, and pick the new guy, Shor, who is now her favored. And Jorlin is very resentful towards Elvara of that treatment, and that would come into play later in the session. So they show up just to kind of introduce her to the characters, and kind of did like like, you know, Elvara's like, oh, how are the dogs doing today, kind of thing. And the paladin, which, you know, I actually think if Ken LaFlaunt had been there, he would have maybe been the first one to speak up. But Sir Robert, whether it be his reflex as a paladin, or his nobility as a lord, basically kind of mouthed off a little bit, and was kind of like, like, you don't scare us, kind of thing. I've been here for 8 days. You don't scare me. And maybe offered some kind of insult. And so, I mean, I think we've all watched enough movies to know how to punish the good guy, right? You don't punish them, you punish someone else instead. And so Elvira basically said, "Oh, Sir Robert, like, I can't believe you don't know me better than that. I guess we'll have to rectify that." And so, using some notes I actually found of the way a few other people did, is I had them go in and essentially grab Eldith, the shield dwarf, and drag her kicking and screaming to the out of the pen, to the edge of the cliff, because this whole prison camp is built like 100 feet above the ground into the cavern wall of this massive gorge in the Underdark, with giant stalactites that have been hollowed out and used as quarters for the drow. So it's a really interesting kind of locale. And essentially, they tied her up with spider web, because there's spider webs all over the place, because the drow have these giant spiders hanging around. And they just kicked her over the edge with just enough length of the rope to dangle her above the webbing where the spiders are. So it was essentially this dwarf being hung upside down by the feet, screaming as these spiders were snapping at her. Like, they couldn't get to her, but they were terrifying her. And then, like, Elvira kind of almost being like turned on by the screams, kind of starts kissing on shore, and they disappear together. And then after an hour or so, the screams of the dwarf died down, replaced by the screams of, like, Elvira doing the do with shore in her own quarters, kind of thing. And eventually, the dwarf, all the blood ran to her head, and she passed out, and they pulled her back up and threw her in. And that was all the paladin needed to not really mouth off again. So I was happy with the way that encounter went. In addition, the next thing that happened was, it was like, okay, you guys have a lay of this camp, because you're being taken out almost daily to do like just menial chores that sometimes are useful and sometimes are just because the drow are bored. So they were broken up into groups of 3 and taken under armed guard to do various tasks. So I had the paladin and a couple buddies were taken to the Quagoth den to basically shovel poop. They just had to kind of clean out the Quagoth den over the side into this pool at the bottom of the gorge where this little waterfall was pouring into. So they put the paladin and Darendel and someone else in there, and the idea was like, oh, we'll take the highborn and we'll make them shovel poop, and that's hilarious. Then they took the monk, Uta, and Shushar, and I think Bapito, and they said, you're going to come over here and fold laundry. And it was like, oh, okay. And they did all the laundry, and it took them, minutes to do the laundry. And then they're like, okay. I said, are you guys done? They said, yeah, we're done. Well, I guess we'll tell the guards that we're done. And so, not even the same guards that brought them in. They were like over at a table playing cards, and he said, oh, like, we're done. So the guard puts his cards down and comes over, and he says, oh, yeah, okay. There's a problem, though. And the PCs are like, well, what's the problem? They said, well, you didn't fold all of the clothes. They said, well, what are you talking about? We fold them all right here. And they said, really? It doesn't look like that way to me. And just basically swatted all the clothes over and made them start over again. And so that would have been fine, except how I kind of got the point across them of what was going on, from a minor nuisance to like, this is hell, is I say, okay, so you do that, and then you continue to do that laundry for about 3 hours. So it was just 3 hours of a 5-minute job over and over again, and not much they could do about it. Another group was taken to like the kitchen area kind of thing and told to do the dishes. And we had a similar situation where, I made the character do a dex saving throw just to see if he would break any dishes while he was doing them. And he passed that, which was great. But, I didn't want to let him get away that easy. So eventually, when he was done doing all these gross dishes, the drow guard came over and said, well, you did a good job, but it's too bad that you're such a butterfingers. And he says, well, what do you mean? And the drow basically like grabs one dish and stares at him in the eye and goes, and breaks it, type of thing. Actually, sorry, you know what? The character failed their dex save, but is a warlock, and one of his spells was Minor Illusion. And Minor Illusion had no verbal component to it. So he broke a dish, and illusioned that it didn't break. And they heard something and came over, and that's how the whole encounter started. And so he dropped this dish, and then the warlock mouthed off a little bit, and not the first time. So they basically beat the tar out of him, and they said, well, you know, if you don't want to talk to us, we can always have you talk to Mistress Elvira. And he's like, oh, sure, because, you know, I came here to deliver goods to her, and she threw me in this prison, which basically happened because then his little demon was like, oh, you should also have relations with Mistress Elvira, and that, of course, landed him in prison. So they drag him to Elvira's chambers, all beat up. And Elvira comes down after their summons and has a little exchange with him, and then bolts him to the wall. Like, they're all in chains, right? They're in neck chains and anklet chains. And she basically has him like this to the wall, and she says, well, you certainly like to talk. So, and this is another idea I pulled from another DM, so props to them, is she said, well, you really like to talk, and you're going on and on about this razor wire delivery that you're supposed to make. Why don't you tell me the whole story? But let's make a game of it. You have to tell me your entire life story without using the word the. And if you do, and she takes out her like rod of tentacles, and she says, you get lashes. And then we'll start again. And so they went through this little exercise, and the PC was actually really good about not using the word the, but obviously Elvira found other things to get anxious over or upset about. And so he took a couple lashes, and it was not a good time for him. But eventually she said, well, I'm bored of this game, but you did a good job, so I'll tell you what. You guys get to make your own dinner tonight rather than eating the garbage that we give you. You know, and so you could pick 3 other friends and go and do that, because I'm figuring he'll probably take the other 3 PCs, right? So that happens. And the last group is taken down to this pool through a lift. There's like a lift that operates, brings people down to the bottom. And this drow takes, I think, the half-orc bard and the shield dwarf, Eldith, and they take them down to around this pond, or this pool, and it basically says, yeah, stack those rocks. And they're like, what? And he said, yep, just stack those rocks. And they're not small rocks. So I'm having them do like strength checks, like athletic checks, things like this. And you know, they're doing it, but it's exhausting work, right? So they're very off guard. And then what happens is the guard comes over. And they're all disrespectful all the time, right? Like surface scum and spitting on their boots and stuff like that. So he says, oh, you're done? And he says, they're panting, and they're like, yeah, we're done stacking these. You know, by the time the rocks are stacked, they're about as tall as Eldith are, kind of thing. And the drow says, okay. And I say, and so the drow leans back and raises his foot, and they're thinking, well, we heard what was going on with the laundry, so we just assume he's going to kick the rocks over and make us start again. Well, no, what he does is he kicks Eldith in the back, and she stumbles into the pond, which to the drow is very funny, because the pond is like where the chamber pots are emptied. Like it's just sewage. It's not a good place to be. So the dwarf, which, you know, I'm role playing, it's an NPC. You know, the dwarf just is covered in just muck and garbage, and she's coughing, and she realizes what she's in, and she throws up in front of her, which she's in water. So now all her vomit is just floating in front of her. And the drow kind of chuckles and walks away. But what makes it is that it says in the notes that there's actually a gray ooze, the very same one that attacked Jorlin, that is living in that pool of muck, and that it even, you know, telepathically communicates this idea of, you know, like flesh for the faceless lord, which the characters have no idea what that means, and it attacks, and I played it off. I didn't want combat right now, so I played it off like Jaws. I had the whole map drawn out in like dry erase marker on this big grid that we have. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. And I basically placed the gray ooze mini, because we use minis, at the far end of the pool. And the idea was that Eldith is like, oh my God, there's something in here with me, get me out of here. And so we did roll initiative with the idea of the ooze is slowly moving towards them. And it's an ooze. I mean, it's a gray ooze, but it's an ooze. So it's borderline invisible in this pool of muck. So rather than actually see something, they just hear this scary voice and then see kind of ripples in the water moving towards them. So it's this really scary scene, and the initiative was to say that the muck is moving, like the ooze is moving closer and closer, and the dwarf is trying to swim to the shore, and the half orc bard successfully yanks her out before the ooze can get there, and it just kind of goes back into the pool. So that was a really fun scene as well. So anyways, long story short, they basically learned that life is terrible living in here, and they're back in their cell and they're talking amongst themselves. They're creating some really good relationships with the NPCs, which is awesome because that's so important for this story, I find. I mean, I'm sure in general, but these 10 NPCs that they're imprisoned with could realistically be with them the entire time, depending. So they start talking amongst themselves to say, well, we got to get out of here. How are we going to do this? And pretty much everyone's on board. At one point, the guards start antagonizing Ront when Shore brings them their food, and Ront kind of charges the cage, and Shore, basically his badge of office is this wand of like sticky globs kind of thing, and he shoots it at him as the orc's charging forward. It globs his feet to the ground, and he falls forward going full sprint with his feet glued to the ground. So he basically like breaks one of his shins. Like this orc now has a broken leg, and he's sitting there just screaming in pain, and the drow laughs and starts to walk away, and Jorlin's coming in as Shore is leaving, and Shore just kind of, you know, elbows him and is like, you know, and as he elbows him, his scarf that he uses to hide his face falls away a bit, and he's like, yeah, it's no wonder that you're too gross for Elvira now, like enjoy your time being a regular, and moves away. And so Jorlin comes up, and basically his job is to relieve the guards so that the next shift can come in. So he relieves them. And they've been doing all this planning about here's what we're going to do, here's what we're going to do. And eventually Jorlin kind of says to the paladin who had gone over to check on the orc, he says to Sir Robert, he goes, psst, and he comes over and he says, look, if I were to give you a means of escape, would you take it? And the paladin says, well, I mean, yes, but why would you do that? And Jorlin basically goes on a little rant, a very quick rant about how he hates Elvira and she ruined his life, and he just wants to see her fall from grace. So what better way to do that than throw her institution into chaos and with a prison escape? And then he just basically spun on his heel and walked away because the new guards were there. So now the players are really excited because they're thinking, okay, now we've got an opening. We just got to figure out how we're going to get from here, all the way to over here at the other end where the lift is to get down. Because one option was to jump into the pool, but they figure out it's 100 feet and there's something gross in there, and we don't want to deal with that. So how can we stealth our way over there? And they're going through all these ideas. So anyways, eventually they say, okay, we've got our plan, and Jorlin comes to gather up. It's like the next day or something, so that no one's unconscious from drow poison, because the drow don't take any lip. If they don't like what you're doing, they're going to shoot you with a crossbow with drow poison. That basically just knocks you out. Doesn't really do a lot of damage; it just knocks you out unconscious. So everyone's up and at him, and they say, okay, we're ready. So Jorlin comes and he says, okay, changing of the guards. So as the guards move away, he basically says, okay, don't screw this up for me, make your move, and he leaves the cage unlocked and takes off. Okay, so all the characters go out, and the way it's positioned is there's like the Quagoth den and a guard post to their immediate right, and then straight ahead is a wooden bridge that goes over to the first stalactite that is like the armory, the guard post, and all the spider webbing underneath and everything. So they split up into two groups, and they say this group's going to go towards the armory, and this group's going to go to take care of the guards in that outpost. So they start making their ways, they split up, and at that moment, there's a really cool event that I don't know why you would not choose for this to happen, I guess, but it says you can choose for it to happen, where essentially a group of like 6 massive demons come flying through of 2 different factions, and they're just basically buzzing around Velkenvelv and fighting each other and screeching and using all their fantastical abilities. And so they hear first this buzzing and screeching, and then like an alarm bell starts ringing, like like a town bell, and all of the drow guards they see out the other side of the stalactite pour out of the armory and go over to basically line up against the wall and start shooting their crossbows at these giant demons that are flying around. So the player characters are like, oh my God, this is perfect. All we have to do is make sure the Quagoths don't come out of the den. So at first they're like, oh, we'll get the two biggest, strongest people to hold it shut. And eventually the Warlock was like, oh, guys, I got this. And so he does minor illusion, and he uses it to impersonate the voice of Mistress Elvira, basically commanding the Quagoths to stay where they are. And I thought that was great. I mean, it's the head of the outpost. The Quagoths are already like a servitor race to these Drow, and they're not particularly bright. So all of the kind of pushing at the door of them trying to hold it shut stops, and you hear kind of like a sniffing noise, and then they just go back to bed or whatever they're doing. I don't know. So they played that off well, and then they went into the armory and they got some very basic equipment, chain shirts and short swords, and then they had to make a choice because they opened the door and they see all these Drow, and I said, you know what, some people, some DMs had their players basically really start with nothing. Going into this. And I think that the opening of this campaign is punishing enough, especially when they start traveling through the Underdark. So I didn't want my players to have nothing going into the traversing the Underdark, basically. Nothing meaning for me, just like short swords and chain shirts and leather armor like that. I didn't want that, especially because I don't want these players to die. If they do, they do, but I really don't want them to because they're all great characters. So I said, okay, so you open the door, and they're seeing a scene that is Drow lined up near the other stalagmite, so there's no way they're going to get to that one. And their options are they could try and fight, which is a really bad idea. Like, these Drow warriors would probably just rip them apart. Or they can basically dive off into the pool, which is also not particularly safe. So as they're deciding what they think they might do, it's all chaos and everything. And I say, well, one of the demons basically gets, whether through Drow poison or one of the other demons attacking it, basically careens into the side of the ledge and just smushes like 3 to 4 of the Drow, and all of them just tumbled down into the below. And that gave them enough of an opening that all the rest of the Drow fighting were at the far end, and there was no one really by that. So, and they know that I forgot to mention that they had seen Mistress Elvira and like her 2 consorts kind of like emerge from that particular stalactite, just panicked and frustrated, not really afraid, but just kind of like, what now? And so they have joined the fray with these demons as well. So the characters say, okay, well, our options are, well, why don't we jump into the spider webs as a medium and then drop down from the spider webs into the pool? But Sir Robert and Colby and a few of the NPCs were like, well, we want to go in that other stalactite because if our stuff wasn't in the armory, then all of our confiscated goods are probably where the priestess was. So let's go check that out. So they did, and what wound up happening is the players that jumped into the spider web, a couple of them got stuck, but most of them didn't. However, they were ambushed by a pair of giant spiders that kind of felt the ones that got stuck and said, oh, dinner time kind of thing. And then the ones that went into the stalactite, there was another giant spider hiding in there like a pet, basically, that Elvira had trained, and a statue of a giant spider that one of the characters actually failed their wisdom check and thought that it was a second giant spider because it was so lifelike. So long story short, the paladin got really bitten quite badly by the spider, but they did defeat it. And then the spider eye statues were these pieces of jet, like this precious stone jet, if you're familiar with that. And the paladin says, yeah, like, I mean, I don't worship this terrible idol. They're garbage anyways. I'm going to pry out those eyes and sell them later. So that's what he did. And the warlock went upstairs to the second layer of this stalactite, and it was very obviously Elvira's quarters. And one of the first things he noticed is this big giant chest, and he says, oh, that's where our stuff is for sure. So I say, well, what do? He says, well, I'm going to go to the chest first, and I'm going to open that up. I said, okay. So what he said was, I'm going to go search the chest. And I wanted to be sure that I knew what he was doing. So I said, when you say search, what do you mean? Because I want to know if he's investigating the chest or if he's just going to open it. He says, well, like, I want to open it up and see what's inside. I said, okay, great. So he walks over and I said, and as you open, even though there's a keyhole, it's not locked, you open it, but out of the keyhole shoots this little needle and it goes, boop, and it just pricks you. And he says, well, what happens? I said, well, you take 1 point of damage. He says, well, that's not that bad. He says, however, make a con saving throw because it's poisoned. Now, if you would have failed the check, Nearly failed the check is what I should say. He would have just been hit. He would have been poisoned for an hour, which means I think he gets disadvantage on attack and ability check rolls. But he failed spectacularly, in so much so that the book says, look, if they fail by 5 or more, not only are they poisoned, but they fall unconscious for an hour, which is like insanely bad because they're in the process of breaking out. So he falls unconscious. He, the chest closes. And he just slumps over it. And meanwhile, in the webbing, they're still all in chains, so all their attacks have been at disadvantage, with the exception of the casters. Eventually, the half-orc barbarian says, well, I rage out, and I try and break my chain, so he gets advantage on the strength check. She rolls a nat 20, and I say, yeah, you just hulk out and shear these chains apart, and then she did her attack and just really walloped one of the spiders. The NPCs and the PC kind of ganged up on the other one, and the tortoise is actually quite strong. The turtle, I should say, and he breaks his chains as well on like the first try. And the running joke was that he was so slow that he'd actually started breaking his chains at the very start of the session, but just kind of moved so slowly that just now they had reached the breaking point and now he was free. So everyone had a kind of a good laugh at that. But anyway, so they killed their spiders, and the Sir Robert went upstairs to check on what Colby was doing, and saw that he was unconscious, and kind of said, okay, the time has come for me to re-embrace some of my paladinhood. And he essentially uses like a lay on hands to cure his poison and heal him and bring him out of it type of thing, which I was fine with. Thought it was very good. And so they opened the chest and they gathered up, them and these other 3 or 4 NPCs, gathered up all the equipment that the prisoners would have had, that the drow would not have, destroyed or eaten, and basically took it all and said, let's get out of here. So they all jumped down into the webbing where the 2 other spiders had been defeated, and the weight was enough and the damage to the webbing was enough that the webs actually broke and they all fell into the pool. And then, of course, that gray ooze is still in there. And like all but 4 of the characters scrambled out of the pool before combat even started. And then it was a case of, okay, well, you've got Ront, the kind of hobbled orc. You've got Sir Robert. You've got the dwarf Eldith. And you've got, actually, I think that might have even been it. Were stuck in this pool with the gray ooze. Now the gray ooze, it wasn't a jaw situation. It was like, you may very well have to fight this thing. So combat started. They kind of found out how scary the gray ooze could be. So the dwarf just paddled as fast as he could, got out of the water. The ooze got a critical hit on the orc Ront, which did an amazing amount of damage. Not enough to outright kill him, but definitely made him go unconscious. And then he just slipped beneath the water. And so now the paladin's like, oh my god. He tried to use his action to essentially grab the orc from underwater and bring him to the shore, but his check was not good enough. And so he failed to do so. He rolled like a 2 or something. So he really failed to do so. And the ooze turns was up again, and the ooze, I'm like, well, it's a hungry monster basically, and he's got this orc right in front of him, and the paladin hasn't really attacked him. So the ooze just basically coup de grace the orc and just basically envelops him and starts eating him. And at that point, the paladin, who is terribly upset that this has happened, just basically says, yeah, okay, I'm out. So he scrambles out, and the ooze just kind of sinks back into the pond and eats its meal. And so all of these characters now scramble. They're like, well, where are we going to go? Where are we going to go? And they all decide that they're going to take Shushar's advice, and they're going to go to Sloopbludop because it's the closest place. It's like 8 days away, and every other place that they could go is like 20 to 40 days away of travel. And considering they have nothing, that's a pretty dangerous prospect in the Underdark, which is essentially an alien planet to them. So they say, great, we're going to go that way. So they go, and as they're leaving, another one of these demons, heavily injured, kind of crashes in front of them. And it basically kind of shakes its head. It's looking very bloodied, and it looks at them, and it just lets out like a screech. It just screams at them. And at this point, if the players would have just been like, okay, we don't want that, then the demon would have just basically been like, you're damn straight you don't, and flew off to rejoin the fight. But the paladin basically says, oh my god, I throw my short sword at it. And so he whips the sword, which doesn't do anything. It was really for narrative effect, and it initiated combat. So combat starts up, and basically two real things of note happen. Essentially, the demon in one go basically just claws the paladin to shreds, and he falls unconscious. And then by a combination of the still berserking orc, half orc bard, and the name bard, not class bard, and the monk who has been very effective with his double unarmed punching and that kind of thing, basically destroy this demon, which is a very weakened version of what it actually is. But it was a cool little last thing. So they had found a couple healing potions in Elvara's chamber. They dumped one into the paladin's mouth and were like, we need to get going. And so they scrambled down into this dark passage leading off towards Sloop Bludop. And that's pretty much where we ended off for the night. So it was really fun. I got some feedback from the players. They loved it. There's a lot that's in store for them on their way to Sloop Bludop. A couple random encounters, a couple deepening of relationships with these NPCs, maybe even finding out some things about them they didn't know before. I know a lot of fun things that are going to happen, but I'm not going to say that because I wanted my player characters to be able to watch these videos if they wanted to. So, but yeah, that was our first session. I thought everything was great. Of course, if you have any comments or feedback from me, don't be afraid to post them. I'll love to read them, and if I've done anything wrong, although I think it's kind of hard for the DM to do things wrong because for the most part everything's at their discretion for the benefit of the story, as long as it is for the benefit of the story, right? I'm not going to be vindictive towards my players. We very much have this social contract between us to all work together to build this story. And yes, there's dice, and yes, there's combat, but at its heart, we all want to have a good time, and I think that was accomplished in this first session. So next session, I'll do another one of these videos, and next session I feel will probably be completely taken up by the journey to Sloop Bludop and their encounters along the way. Typically, when we played in Ryan's campaign, we would wind up playing from like 6 to midnight type of thing. They were long sessions, and no one minded them. But we usually play on Sundays, and Monday is a work day type of thing. So this particular session ran from 8 o'clock because we all did character building together at 7 before. So this ran from 8 o'clock till about 1 in the morning. But everyone was so engaged that they were like, yeah, that's fine. This was great. I mean, don't do this usually, but this was great. So we left it off there. I think that normally we might get into the habit of, unless the situation calls for it, maybe doing sessions that are a bit shorter, like maybe 3 or 4 hours. And so realistic, really running from maybe like 6 to 10 or 7 to 11, something like that. A little bit more reasonable for people's schedules. So by that same logic, I think that the whole next session is going to be them trouncing through the Underdark, trying to find their way to Sloop Bludop with Shushar's guidance, I assume, because that's where he's from, and just the things that they're going to encounter along the way. And then Session 3 will most likely be either the conclusion of that travel and Sloop Bludop, or Sloop Bludop and the continuation of their travel. We'll have to see how it goes. But again, I'm Anthony, and thank you for watching my first little video entry in my adventures, DMing Out of the Abyss for 5th edition D&D. Okay, we'll see you next time. Bye.